This presentation breaks down thinking errors, also called cognitive distortions, and how they directly influence addiction, mental health, behavior patterns, and relapse cycles. Many people think relapse starts with the substance use itself, but relapse usually begins long before the behavior ever happens. It often starts with distorted thinking patterns that slowly change how a person interprets stress, emotions, pain, rejection, accountability, relationships, and decision making. These thoughts are often connected to deeper core beliefs and unresolved issues a person carries about themselves or the world around them. Beliefs like, I'm not enough, I always fail, nobody understands me, she'll just cheat, I've been clean long enough, or things will never change. All these things can shape emotional reactions and increase vulnerability to unhealthy coping behaviors. Triggers, whether emotional, environmental, relational, or internal, can activate these core beliefs and distortions. Once triggered, the brain begins searching for relief, escape, comfort, control, or emotional regulation. For some people, substances became the coping mechanism where they once found relief, numbness, reward, or temporary emotional stability, a false sense of security. And over time, these repeated cycles become tied to memory, survival responses, emotional conditioning, and chemical imbalances within the brain and body. The behavior may temporarily reduce emotional pain, but it also reinforces the distorted thinking and strengthens the relapse cycle. And addiction is not always just about substances. The same relapse patterns and thinking errors can lead to unhealthy acting out behaviors, self-destruction, isolation, anger, compulsive behaviors, avoidance, or other harmful coping patterns. Hi, I'm Robert Shingleton. Understanding these distortions is important because we learn to recognize unhealthy thinking early. We gain the ability to interrupt the cycle before it progresses into an action. The early awareness happens, the greater the chance to mentally and physically reframe, reconnect to truth and accountability, and get off the Ferris wheel before the ride reaches relapse or use. Every behavior begins with thought. Thoughts influence emotions. Emotions influence decisions, and repeated decisions eventually become behavior patterns. When thinking becomes distorted, the brain starts interpreting reality inaccurately. In addiction recovery, this can become dangerous because the person may begin justifying unhealthy decisions, exaggerating emotional pain, minimizing consequences, or believing hopeless thoughts that are not objectively true. Most relapse cycles do not happen impulsively out of nowhere. There is usually a progression. A thought becomes believable, the emotion intensifies, and the person rationalizes behavior, and eventually the relapse feels emotionally justified. That is why relapse prevention is not only about stopping behavior, it is about learning how to challenge distorted thinking before it turns into actions. So here is a list of 21 major thinking errors that are commonly connected to addiction and the relapse cycles. These distortions rarely happen alone. In real life relapse situations, several distortions usually work together at the same time. For example, someone may catastrophize a stressful situation, emotionally reason that they cannot handle it, justify using substance to escape, and then minimize the consequences afterwards. Stress, shame, trauma, withdrawal, isolation, emotional overwhelm all increase distorted thinking. The more emotionally dysregulated a person becomes, the harder it becomes to think objectively. That is why awareness matters. You cannot correct a thought pattern you do not recognize. All or nothing thinking is black and white thinking. The person sees themselves as either completely successful or completely failed, with no middle ground in between. In recovery, this becomes very dangerous because recovery is rarely perfect. For example, someone may have 6 months sober, experience one slip, and immediately think, I ruined everything. Instead of correcting the mistake early and reaching out for support, they continue using because they believed recovery is already destroyed. The relapse becomes larger because the thinking tells them there is no point stopping now. The distortion turns temporary setbacks into full relapse cycles. Healthy recovery requires understanding that mistakes do not erase progress. A lapse does not have to become a collapse. Minimization happens when the brain reduces the seriousness of the behavior in order to avoid guilt, fear, or accountability. The person mentally shrinks the danger so it feels acceptable. Here's an example. Someone reconnects with old using environments or friends or people and say, I'm just visiting them. I can handle it. Nothing's going to happen. Or after using once, they may say, it was only one time. But addiction relapse often begins through repeated small boundary violations. Every time the behavior is minimized, the internal warning system weakens. Eventually, behaviors that once felt dangerous begin feeling normal. Minimization is dangerous because it makes relapse progression feel harmless while the consequences slowly grow larger. So let's go to catastrophizing. Catastrophizing happens when the brain turns emotional discomfort into a worst case scenario. Instead of seeing pain as a temporary, the person experiences as a permanent and unbearable. For example, someone struggling with withdrawal, depression, stress, or loneliness may begin thinking, I'll never feel normal again, nothing's ever going to get better. And this creates hopelessness, and hopelessness is one of the strongest emotional triggers for relapse. When the brain believes suffering is permanent, escape starts feeling necessary. Substances then become viewed as an immediate relief for emotional overwhelm. The danger is not only the situation itself, it is the exaggerated interpretation of the situation. Emotional reasoning happens when feelings are treated as evidence. Instead of asking, what are the facts? The brain asks, what do I feel right now? In addiction recovery, this becomes dangerous because cravings feel emotionally and physically intense. For example, someone may feel anxiety, loneliness, shame, anger, or emotional pain and immediately interpret that feeling as, I need relief. I can't handle this. But feelings are temporary emotional states, not instructions. A craving can feel powerful without being necessary to act on. The stronger the feeling becomes, the more believable distorted thought becomes. Recovery requires learning how to tolerate emotion without automatically obeying it. Justification happens when the mind creates logical sounding reasons to make destructive behavior feel acceptable. This is where relapse often becomes mentally approved before it becomes physical behaviors. For example, someone may think, I've been through too much. I've worked hard enough. I deserve this. The brain reframes substance use from something harmful into something understandable or earned, a reward. This lowers resistance. Instead of fighting the urge, the person begins negotiating with it. Many relapse decisions happen because the behavior becomes emotionally justified long before the action occurs or the use. The danger of rationalization is that it can make harmful behavior feel reasonable and acceptable. Next, we got personalization. And personalization happens when someone takes excessive responsibility for everything around them. They begin internalizing problems that may not fully belong to them. Here's an example. Someone may think, my family struggles because of me. I ruin everything. This creates intense shame, and shame often leads to withdrawal and isolation. Isolation removes the accountability, support systems, honesty, and connection, all of which protect recovery. The more isolated the person becomes emotionally, the more vulnerable they become to relapse thinking. Overgeneralization happens when negative events become a conclusion about the entire future. Let me give you an example. Someone relapses one time and immediately they think, I'll never recover. I always mess things up. Instead of viewing the relapse as one event, the brain turns it into a permanent identity statement. This destroys motivation because hopelessness replaces effort. The person stops seeing future possibilities and begins believing failure is inevitable. So recovery becomes difficult when temporary mistakes become permanent conclusions. So mental filtering happens when the brain focuses entirely on negatives while ignoring all the positives and good things. Here's an example. Someone may have 90 days sober, rebuilt relationships, improved emotionally, and stayed accountable. But after one mistake, one slip up, all they focus on is failure. The mind filters out evidence of growth and progression, and this weakens confidence and motivation because progress no longer feels meaningful. When recovery successes become invisible, relapse starts feeling like the only thing that matters. And then we're going to go to disqualifying the positive. And disqualifying the positive happens when someone dismisses genuine progress, growth, or success. For instance, a person will say, my sober time doesn't matter now. Anyone could have done this. Even real accomplishments become emotionally invalidated. This distortion damages self-worth because the brain refuses to accept evidence of improvement and progress. Over time, the person stops believing change is real or even sustainable. Healthy recovery requires learning to acknowledge progress without perfection. This one's a very common one, jumping to conclusions. Jumping to conclusions happens when the brain assumes outcomes without evidence. For instance, someone will think, I know I'm going to relapse anyways. Even though nothing has happened yet, the person behaves as if failure is already guaranteed. This affects motivation, effort, and their decision making. The person may stop attending meetings, stop reaching out, or stop following recovery routines because mentally they're checked out. They already believe the outcome is decided. Distorted predictions often become self-fulfilling behaviors. Here's another common one, mind reading. Mind reading happens when someone assumes they know what others think about them without actual evidence. For instance, someone may avoid meetings, work, or support systems because they assume everyone is talking about them, or judging them. The problem is not actual rejection, it is perceived rejection. This creates withdrawal and isolation. Isolation then increases vulnerability to relapse because support systems become disconnected. Next, we go to fortune telling. And fortune telling happens when someone predicts failure before giving themselves the opportunity to even succeed. For example, recovery never works for me. Or they say, I already know how this ends. This distortion removes hope before effort begins as well. When failure feels certain, motivation decreases, and the person might stop trying because emotionally they already believe the outcome is decided. What they think about, they act out. Here's the should statements. Should statements create unrealistic pressure and rigid expectations. For instance, they say, I should be stronger, or I should be fully healed by now. When reality does not match these expectations, guilt and shame increase. Instead of motivating change, the pressure often creates discouragement and self-criticism. Recovery is a process, not a timeline. Labeling happens when someone defines themselves entirely by mistakes or their struggles. Instead of them saying, I made a mistake, they say, I am the mistake. This is dangerous because identity strongly influences behaviors. When someone repeatedly labels themselves negatively, hopelessness grows stronger. The person begins behaving consistently with the identity they believe about themselves. Healthy recovery separates behavior from their identity. The control fallacy. The control fallacy exists at two unhealthy extremes. One side believes, I have no control, and the other believes, I can control everything. Helplessness leads to giving up. Overconfidence leads to isolation and poor boundaries. Healthy recovery requires balance, understanding what can be controlled and what cannot. Recovery becomes stronger when responsibility replaces helplessness without turning into unrealistic self-reliance. Blame. Blaming happens when responsibility for behavior is placed entirely on outside people or circumstances. For instance, they'd say, they stressed me out, so I used, or she cheated on me, or it's their fault. While stress may be real, blaming removes ownership and accountability. Without ownership, change becomes difficult because the person believes the solution exists outside themselves. Fallacy of fairness. The fallacy of fairness happens when someone believes life must feel fair in order to cope appropriately. For example, someone experiences suffering and thinks, this isn't fair, so I deserve relief. Emotional pain then becomes permission for destructive behavior. The problem is that life is not always fair, but recovery still requires healthy responses despite unfair circumstances. Fallacy of change. The distortion happens when someone believes their healing depends entirely on other people changing first. For example, I'd be okay if they changed. This delays personal responsibility and keeps recovery dependent on external circumstances. Real recovery begins when individuals focus on what they can control within themselves. The always being right thinking error. Always being right creates defensiveness and resistance to feedback. For example, someone rejects support, accountability, or correction because they believe they already understand everything. In recovery, this becomes very dangerous because outside perspective is often necessary for growth. Defensiveness blocks learning, honesty, and self awareness. The good old heaven's reward fallacy. Heaven's reward fallacy happens when someone believes good behavior deserves unhealthy rewards. For instance, they'd say, I've been sober for months, so I deserve one time. Or, I have 3 years. One time won't hurt. The brain turns recovery progress into justification for breaking recovery boundaries. Instead of protecting progress, the person uses progress itself as permission to relapse. Magnification thinking error. Magnification happens when relatively manageable problems become emotionally overwhelming. For instance, a stressful conversation, rejection, financial issues, a breakup, or disappointment becomes mentally inflated into thinking things like everything is falling apart. The emotional intensity becomes so large that escape begins feeling necessary. This increases relapse vulnerability because substances become associated with immediate relief from overwhelming stress. All of these thinking errors share one thing in common. They distort reality in ways that make destructive behavior feel emotionally reasonable. Relapse usually begins long before the substance itself is used. It often begins with distorted thoughts, unchecked emotions, hopeless beliefs, rationalization, triggers, or unhealthy interpretations of pain, stress, rejection, shame, fear, or discomforts. Many of these thinking errors are connected to deeper core beliefs and unresolved issues people carry about themselves, others, or the world around them. Thoughts like, I'm not good enough, nothing will ever change, I always fail, nobody understands me, she's just gonna cheat anyways, it's just one time, I have years clean, one time I deserve it. All of these can quietly drive the relapse cycle underneath the surface. Triggers activate emotions, emotions activate thinking errors, and thinking errors begin shaping behavior. The longer these thoughts go unchallenged, the more believable they become. Eventually, behavior follows belief. That is why awareness is so important in recovery. Recovery begins to change when a person can recognize distorted thinking in real time and challenge it before it turns into action. A person can mentally and physically reframe at any point in the relapse cycle. They can pause, reach out, change environments, challenge the thought, regulate emotions, use their coping skills, reconnect to truth, accountability, purpose, and support. You can get off the Ferris wheel anytime. You can stop the ride before it reaches the point of use. The interruption is where long-term recovery, accountability, emotional growth, resilience, and real transformation begins.